Now let's move on to what I think is really unpleasant stuff, and that is that the British government has decided that it's going to provide Ukraine not only with the Challenger tanks, but also with the depleted uranium shells to go with them. So the BBC News here, UK defends sending uranium shells after Putin warning. What are we really talking about here? We're talking about depleted uranium, effectively toxic in its own right, but when it's fired as a munition, it vaporizes and the dust is very toxic indeed. Radiation, relatively small, but it's toxic, very toxic, and has caused huge problems in the Middle East. And now Britain is to supply this ammunition. And what is it ultimately going to do? To destroy lives and pollute the environment in Ukraine. But the BBC, that's busy trying to play this down at the moment, if we jump back to 2006, we've got a BBC report, Depleted Uranium Risk Ignored. UK and US forces have continued to use depleted uranium warnings depleted uranium weapons despite warnings they pose a cancer risk. And in this report, which I encourage viewers to find and read, it talks about a senior UN scientist said research showed how depleted uranium could cause cancer, but that report was withheld. Of course, the UK Ministry of Defence said there was nothing wrong with it. But in fact, many years ago, if you remember, Mike, I certainly do, we met a former UK soldier who'd been a machine gunner. His hands were in an appalling condition with the skin very dry, cracks all over his hands and particularly his fingers. And when we asked him about this, he said it was the result of depleted uranium dust, which covers the hands of gunners who use it in smaller caliber rounds. So the BBC has forgotten about environmental protection. It's okay to pump in the depleted uranium to Ukraine to destroy lives and to destroy countryside effectively. This is how bad it gets with the BBC, because if you go looking for the story, we've got the Challenger tanks, but really nothing credible. So, Mike, I don't know what you think about it. I'm always speechless now with the BBC because it's such a disgraceful organisation.
Yeah, well, we should never forget the degree of birth defects that were caused by effectively creating a blanket of depleted uranium across Iraq. So we're going to do that across Ukraine as well. Is this what we do to our allies, Brian?
Well, it's very clear that the lives of Ukrainians are seen as just sacrificial puppets for the agenda of UK and the US. And if they get killed on the battlefield, that's not a problem. If we destroy their families, because that's what's going to happen with depleted uranium, that isn't a problem for the BBC or the British government or the UK Ministry of Defence. Let's have a look at the situation, just one aspect of the situation of the war in Ukraine. A very big thank you here to Brian J. Beletic, who's a former US Marine who's doing very good analysis. This is a time lapse of what the Russians have been doing around Bakhmut, the key fortified city. So let's just run this through. And the thing that you will notice is that the Russian advance is continuing at pace, albeit it's being done by small chunks at a time. So here's the reality of what the Russians are doing, and this is the position of Bakhmut. Here's the Kyiv Independent again saying, as Wagner's offensive in Bakhmut likely nears culmination. They know what's happening. They know that the Russians are going to take Bakhmut. Bakhmut falls, Avdiivka falls. Those are the two key strongholds. But at the moment, we don't want to discuss the reality in UK because it doesn't fit the propaganda. Here's another graphic from Il Russo 12. And what it's showing is Bakhmut as a city and who controls what. So early this morning, the figure was Russians were in control of 63% of the city, the Ukrainians 17%, and the rest is no man's land. But the BBC and the Ministry of Defence would have us believe that nothing is happening. Let's look at this interview clip with Major General Chapman, who's giving his opinion on what he sees as reality in Ukraine.
Logistics are cut off. That plays into this thing, that it plays into the psychological part of war, when an army is pretty easy to collapse if you do those sorts of things.
Hi, as ever, welcome, Chip. What's your latest up-to-date thoughts tonight on the state of the war, on the ground in Ukraine?
Well, there's really not that much change on the ground, and I think we're almost getting to the point where the Russian forces culminate. Now, culmination from a military perspective is when your offensive power has been exhausted and you can go no further. That is a critical moment which would allow Ukraine at a place and time of its own choosing to go on the offensive. Now, I don't think the weather allows that to happen at the moment. It may be that certain other battles will need to be extended at Bakhmut along that part of the line to enable that to occur. But it seems to me that Ukraine are holding the line, and the task and purpose, the hold is a mission verb, that's the task, and the purpose of that is to finally blunt the Russian offensive to allow the conditions where Ukraine can take the offensive.
Yes.
And that really plays in, I think, John, to the deep strike we saw today in Crimea, because the difference really between the Russian deep strike is that the Russian deep strike focuses on the civilian infrastructure of Ukraine to try and break the will of the civilians.
Yes.
Hasn't worked in the first winter and won't. Whereas the Ukrainian deep battle focuses on degrading the military potential of Russia and therefore setting the conditions for counterattacks, including in that region. The attack in Crimea would be to come through probably Zaporizhia and sever the land corridor between the forces in Kherson and those to the east of that.
Well, unfortunately, we haven't got much time in the news today to do the full analysis on what the Major General said. But if he saw a piece of coal, he would describe it as white, because his analysis of the battlefront is 180 degrees out to the reality. We've seen the Russian advances. The Russians move as quickly as they want to. At the moment, Ukrainian casualties as a minimum 250,000 dead, and that is a very low estimate. The Russians are controlling the battlefield. The Ukrainians are running out of ammunition. Their front is beginning to crumble. And what is coming out of this man's mouth for the public in UK, absolutely outrageous. I'll do some more analysis on what he said on Monday for you, but just to illustrate, let's have a look at defense intelligence here. Over recent days, Ukrainian forces initiated a local counterattack. That's all it was, a few tanks and a few men to the west of the Donetsk Oblast town of Bakhmut, which is likely to relieve pressure on the H-32 supply route. No, all the supply routes are cut. Fighting continues around the town centre, and the Ukrainian defence remains at risk from envelopment. It has been encircled. However, there is a realistic possibility that the Russian assault on the town is losing the limited momentum it obtained. This is absolute. I've described it as mind-numbing misinformation from the UK Ministry of Defence. This is propaganda on a scale I could not believe. Put all of this in context, let's have a look at that fantastic Irish MP, Clare Daly, and what she had to say in the European Union.
Listening to the cheerleading in here, safe and secure, thousands of miles away from the front lines, I think it would be a useful exercise for us to remind ourselves about what ordinary Ukrainians are experiencing. The Economist reports of forced recruitment across the country. Draftees with no experience or training are being sent to the front in what a UK minister calls First World War levels of attrition. Casualty figures are secret, but we know they're estimates of about 120,000. Battalion commanders tell the Washington Post of recruits fleeing positions en masse. Politico reports a crackdown on deserters. These are human beings, and there is a shameful lack of empathy for ordinary people in the war rhetoric in here. The debate is about keeping the weapons flowing to keep the war going. Ukraine is burning through a generation of men. sons, husbands, brothers who can never be replaced. This cannot go on indefinitely. And ye sickening war generals who sit in here and will these men to our deaths, you make me sick. We need peace, we need dialogue, however unpleasant that may be.
Well, what a fantastic woman, and doesn't she put the, or very many will say, of the politicians, wherever they are in the UK, the EU or the US, to shame.